welcome. Thank you for joining me today at our School of Information and Communication Studies Research Seminar Series, number 3 in 2026. I would like to start with the acknowledgement of country. As members of Charles Sturt University community, we acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra, and Birapai peoples of Australia, whose land our university was founded on, and we share their aspiration to learn the wisdom of respectfully living well in a land worth living in. I pay my respects to any First Nations people present here today. I am Nilufar Solcu, a lecturer in Information Studies. I am co-organizing this SICS seminar series with my colleague, Victoria. I encourage you to introduce yourself and also share your country or location in a chat box as well. So today we are hearing from Dr. Keith Kavanagh-Ryan. Keith is a lecturer and early career researcher at SICS, whose research relates to disability in children's and young adult literature and intersection of disability studies and librarianship and library programming. Keith has worked across academic, school, and special libraries, and now a monograph called Crip Word Building, based on her PhD research, is under contract with Palgrave Macmillan. Today, Keith is going to talk to us about her seminar on listening for Crip voices in young adult fiction. So I'll leave it with you, Keith. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm coming to you today from unceded Wurundjeri Wurrung land, and I also want to acknowledge that my understanding of and use of disability frameworks is inevitably shaped by an Anglo-Western understanding of disability and impairment. Again, thank you so much for coming here today, and thank you, Nilufar, for making me sound much more impressive than I actually am. So a little bit about me and my work, and I can officially say that Crip World Building has a cover and an August release date now, so I thought I'd sneak that in. But my work sits at the intersection of information, literary, and disability studies. Essentially, my starting assumption is that all fiction, regardless of whether it's fiction for children, fiction for adults, whether it's fantasy, whether it is a coming of age story set in a high school, will create a world, and disabled people will live in most worlds. We are everywhere in narrative, written well and written terribly by Crip authors and abled ones. And my follow-up question is, what does it mean to imagine Crip futures in literature? What does it mean to imagine a world where you can have disability and magic, for example, simultaneously, where the magic isn't curing the impairment? What does it mean when you have all sorts of intersecting relationships between bodies and minds in texts written for young people? I argue that every built environment, and I include fiction as a built environment, makes assumptions about the bodies and behaviors of the humans that inhabit it. I use a combination of critical and narrative theory for this, and I also will argue that built environments absolutely include those found in speculative works of narrative, because if you're building a world from scratch, if you have to create whole rules about what it means to be a person, or what the weather is doing, what the political systems are doing, this is actively asking the author to engage with questions about power dynamics, about people. I will always ask, how are these fictional spaces built to enable or disable a narrative's characters, and whether they offer alternatives to current and persistent meta-narratives or tropes of disability. I'll get more onto that in the next couple of slides. But really, for the interest of all of you here in information studies, my question is, how does this play out through the books we select, prize, and share with young readers? Because I hope that you'll find over the next few slides that there is a definite pattern to books explicitly about disability that receive awards, and they're not usually the ones with dragons in them, but we'll talk more about that later. As part of this work, I need to introduce you to a little bit of disability theory, because the way that we think about disability and impairment will often influence both the theory that we draw upon and how we interact with the world. Disability in Anglo-Western settings is most often understood through a medical model. This is an individual deficit-based idea that relies on an idealized normal that disabled bodies and minds do not or cannot achieve. For example, my body is broken. Fundamentally, I have things wrong with it from birth that mean that I am a constant medical burden to society and therefore have to work to achieve normalcy. The social model, however, is the idea that environments, both literal or metaphorical or structural, actually disable a person. A university campus is challenging for me to navigate without a high level of fitness, balance, and visual acuity because it wasn't built for people without a particular level of fitness, balance, and visual acuity. I need help getting to Building 5 in Wagga because it is not structurally supported for someone who cannot drive and cannot see in the dark. Rebuild the campus and disablement ends, sort of. This is obviously a simplified understanding of the term. The relational model, meanwhile, is the idea that with support, to use me again, I could access or navigate a university campus, but I would still have to contend with falls, pain, or fatigue. The experiences of disability will change over time and fluctuate between environments. We are more or less disabled at different ages in our lives. Disability can show up at any time, and a relational model will allow for that sort of flexibility. It's important at this point to ground my analysis in a broader discussion of the social model stigma and the challenges that arise when trying to discuss these elements together. The social model of disability has inspired generations of activists and allowed for a reshifting of disability from an individual medical problem to a broader understanding of the social barriers to access. Its underpinnings are very Marxist and allow for an important discussion of disability and a person's worth under capitalism and how this is tied to a necessarily limited understanding of productivity. These discussions are important and ongoing, but early, strong social model distinctions between disability and impairment, so the idea that my disability would completely vanish if we just rebuilt the Wagga campus, which was very crucial to the understanding of how an environment might disable someone, has been rightly criticised for its minimisation of pain, illness, discomfort, or any emotion that might provoke pity. Both the medical model of disability, with its specific emphasis on individualized treatment of impairments, and the strong social model, with its insistence on the removal of all impairment or grief from any discussion of disability, are underpinned by an understanding that disability is inherently hierarchical. Essentially, the hierarchy runs: physical disability is slightly better to have than psychosocial disability, which is slightly better to have than intellectual disability. This sounds awful, but underpins a lot of conversations around funding, for example, under a purely medical model standpoint. The current discussions around the NDIS are very much caught up in who is considered worth investing in. And this is leading to a lot of reflections and genuine harm as bodies and minds are categorized and recategorized according to a strict and opaque financial system. Intellectual disability in particular is often completely overlooked in discussions, whether it's a discussion of an actual funding model such as the NDIS or in the work that I do involving representational literature for children, because so often when we consider disability in the fiction that we think of for young people, we'll think of little white boy in wheelchair, or little white girl with guide dog. There are all sorts of hierarchical intersections between gender and sexuality and disability, race, indigeneity, financial security, and my work endeavors to interrogate a lot of that. So I'm now going to be a bit rude and open this up for a couple of observations or chat notes, because I would like somebody to answer the question. When I ask you to think of a children's book with a disabled protagonist or at least a major secondary character, what comes up? Kip, you're excused from this one because we've had this conversation before. But if any of you could have any suggestions? Nilofer, I can't see the chat with the presentation open,
Yeah,
so if you would
there are
volunteer.
some. Yeah, Casey and Jane mentioned The Secret Garden. Casey mentioned Colleen, Heidi.
Okay, yep. So what we have here are historical children's books that, even though they might contain wildly imaginative elements, are still very much grounded in real life experiences of young disabled characters. These are not generally genre works, though The Secret Garden does have magical realism elements to it. And I believe at least 3 of those have the wonderful disability meta-narrative of one's impairment being cured by the magic powers of friendship and fresh air, because historically works for children with disabilities would often emphasize social connection, going out to exercise, or simply the restorative power of being wheeled up hillsides, in Heidi's case, to have disability become less of an immediate problem, because often disability was treated as a metaphor for somebody's distress or sense of social inferiority or guilt. This rather spiky concept is called disability as narrative prosthesis. How am I going for time?
You're all right. Yes,
Yeah,
10 minutes past. Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you for mentioning those children's classics. And in that context, I'll say that while a growing body of scholarship explores the ways in which young adult literature can subvert stereotypical abled expectations of disability and impairment, the way I just did with The Secret Garden, the protagonists of this work often appear to be relegated to hospital walls and high school hallways, or Victorian back bedrooms, if we're to go back to the examples you all gave in the chat. Realist representations, whether subversive or stereotypical, are also more frequently prized in book awards that do explicitly focus on disability, such as the Snyder Family Book Award, or prestigious awards such as the Newbery, which, while it does not center disability specifically, does have particular stereotypes about it, and the narratives that it produces. When disability representation is explored through fantastical or speculative text, the focus will often remain on adult works. And studies exploring the representation of disability in award-winning titles, which is already a gap in the field, are often focused on realist texts or picture books. Helen Adam has done some really wonderful work on the need for a wider range of disability-focused picture books, and how we award representations of disability through the Children's Book Council of Australia, for example. But again, all of this work is mostly focused on works for either really young children or works for older youth that are entirely grounded in reality. The Snyder Family Book Award is a particularly interesting example here, and is one of the few English language awards that explicitly requires central characters with lived experience of disability. 45 texts were nominated for the award between 2020 and 2025 across the categories of young children, middle school, and teen. With my very preliminary at this stage data wrangling and excluding picture books, only 5 nominees or winners were speculative, usually based in magical realism or dystopia. Two versions of speculative fiction that are arguably more connected to reality than something like high fantasy, for example. This analysis is not yet complete, and I intend to combine it with an analysis of the 2020 to 2025 CBCA nominees for younger and older readers, so that I can truly get into what is being prized for young people at this stage, and where the magic is and what we're doing with it. And so I want to come around again to the idea on the question of what does it mean when almost every awarded text that we have is purely representational, or purely, these might be beautiful works that open up open up all sorts of mirrors and windows and glass doors, to reference Rudy and Sims Bishop, as I am obliged to as a children's literature scholar, into into worlds of disabled children, or for non-disabled children, the experience of exploring worlds that they might not know. But what does it mean when the range of texts that are afforded to other readers might not be seen in the samples that get prized in our major awards? What does it mean when we are only afforded afforded pasts and presents without a future? For example, historical novels are a huge part of the Snyder Family Book Award, and there is an absolute argument for presenting examples of being disabled in the past as important for younger readers, because so often we have been erased and overlooked. But I think there is still room amongst that to imagine different futures, as well as articulate the pasts that other people have forgotten. And so I'll tell a quick story. My first experience of an academic conference was with the Children's Literature Association in 2014. It was at the University of South Carolina. The theme was Diverging Diversity, Plurality in Children and Young Adult Literature. I, a baby master's by coursework student at Deakin, who wasn't even sure if I wanted to do a PhD at the time, or why I was doing a second master's in the first place, had submitted an abstract with the confidence that can only come when you're sure something won't be accepted. I was interested then in how fantasy fiction seemed to use miracle cures to cure disability in narrative where it occurred, as if, when in a world of magic, it was impossible to imagine any other desired outcome. My jumped up paper was accepted, and I did present, but I found myself then the only speaker discussing disability, and certainly the only speaker with a visibly Crip lived experience of disability, talking out of more than 400 participants. That idea became the PhD, where I found it much more interesting to explore how literature subverts expectations around disability than in the ways they uphold it. This book that has been gracing the background of my slides, for example, Future Girl by Asphyxia, is one of the few speculative texts that won the Snyder Family Book Award. It's also Australian, so well done for getting out there. But this text uses the idea of a speculative future to imagine how the disabled protagonist might be able to thrive more effectively in a new world than her abled counterparts, because of the flexibility that's given to her through a growing understanding of sign. I wish I could talk just about that book all day. I haven't been able to unpack the true potential of genre world building in this way as much as I would like, because hierarchies always take a while to unpack. But the experience of presenting alone or marooned on a single, not very aligned panel, usually called something like disc/ability with a capital A, is often the way of disability studies representation outside of the field's very own specific conferences. There is a sense of surprise, even amongst those exploring critical frameworks, say in information studies or in literary studies, when disability is at the forefront of my work. And for the 40th IBI World Congress this year, I brought together two other early career researchers, Dr. Elizabeth Leach-Leung, now based in Queen's University, and V. Millen from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. We each study disability, but in wildly different ways. Where I argue for wider genre representation, others may argue that fantasy is perhaps the only place where disability is allowed to exist. This is often an argument people make about Octavia Butler's work for adults, for example, and that the school and historical stories that I am professionally side-eyeing with you today are absolutely necessary to fill other gaps, repairing, to return to Rudine Sims Bishop, windows, mirrors, and doorways that have historically been neglected. while I will not detail the contents of their research at this time, as this session is being recorded, it has been an absolute honour to work with them together to put up a forum where we will have a temporary captive audience of researchers and practitioners all working in some way with books for young people. The theme of this Congress is listening to each other's voices. And in this case, we're bringing together 3 Crip voices in different ways to explore the wide range of literature that is actually actively being published, rewarded, and hopefully over the next few years ignored a little less. Thank you so much. I have some references here if anyone is bored enough to read them, but otherwise I will open this up for questions and any comments.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you for your talk. I was really interested in your point about these fantasy and science fiction capacity to challenge our normal ideas of the human itself. Because I think through fantasy modes, there are many possibilities for other ways of being and doing. I mean, compared to westernized norms, especially in relation to disability, or I can say in indigenous and even post-humanist representations, so such as the animal personhood, hybrid creatures. So thank you so much for bringing this up about these possibilities, and I really relate to your lecture.
Thank you. I would love to work with you on hybrid personhood. That would
Yes, definitely. And I'm now open the floor for the question of our attendants. Please share your comments, question, and reflections. I think in the comment there was one interesting comment from Holly Singh mentioning a Harry Potter as a disabled child, and how sometimes for others it might be questionable how we can see Harry Potter as a disabled person. It was, I think, for me, it was really interesting to see this the interaction here.
There is a scholar called Michel Berube who has a very provocative line that disability studies is overly obsessed with diagnosis, and so a lot of the time we go, oh, this book, it represents exactly one experience of disability, and then we end up in fights about whether facial disfigurement is disabling, or how much facial disfigurement becomes disabling, or intersections of trauma, etc. I think that many experiences can be read cripply, if that makes sense. So if you resonate with that experience, then you're able to make an argument for it. I'm sure that is driving a few of you slightly mad, but that's why I'm so interested in the relational model of disability rather than a pure social model, for example, because it allows for a degree of flexibility there.
Yeah, definitely. Rachel, please.
Just on that, because I know that in a kind of real world context, because there are so many sort of nuanced in terms of sort of more the neurospicy space, that it's really hard to get a diagnosis, and it can be very expensive, and that it's quite accepted for people to use tools, self-diagnose, and self-identify. Why do you think it is that we're so tolerant in society, but so specific and sort of seeking clarity in the literature? Why do you think that nitpickery is occurring? Do you think the literature itself invites it through its structure?
I would push back slightly on the idea that we are tolerant of self-diagnosis. I think that within neurodivergent spaces, we absolutely are. That's a key survival strategy. But that survival strategy comes from being shaped by the expense of the diagnosis, the difficulties that can arise from realizing that your way of experiencing the world has in fact made your life objectively harder, and other such elements. And so I think a lot of disability studies' interest in overly diagnosing characters in narratives that have disability is partly just a sense of reclaiming validity in a world that constantly asks us to justify how expensive we are, which is a bit cynical of me, I'm aware. I do think there are a lot of texts that allow for a more fluid understanding of disability and impairment. Amberlyn Quay-Mullina's work is very good for that. The tribe sequence from 2012 to 2015, there are many characters there who interact with the world in ways that many Western readers would view as disabled, but Quay-Mullina, as a First Nations author, has often pushed back on and said that she doesn't support diagnostic labels for her characters because that. But I do think that it is possible to read, depending upon where you're coming from. Characters will read as disabled or non-disabled, depending upon your own repertoire, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there is a comment from Jane, as her audio is not working. She mentioned that she met a teacher librarian in Sydney last week called Libby Baker, who was presenting on character diversity in Australian picture books. She talks a bit about characters with disability and might be an interesting person for you.
Fantastic. I will absolutely look her up, as I'm wading through CBCA nominees at the moment in preparation for IBI.
Yeah, Kit, speaking of IBI, I was going to ask you if you have interacted with their the outstanding books for young people with disabilities.
I'm hoping to interact with it more once I go. I monitor the awards every 2 years when they come out, but I would love to get on that committee.
There's a question from Philip in the chat box asking about, does your work spill over, or could they spill over into narrative in film and other media?
Absolutely. I talk about Avatar: The Last Airbender a lot in my book, and the Legend of Korra and the whole Avatar verse as a whole. Rachel was very kind many months ago when I was trying to get my head around image licensing in an attempt to have screenshots from the shows in the work. That did not succeed, but I do treat film and animation as texts in my analysis for that work. This current work that I'm doing for IBI is more based on books because of the book awards, obviously, but in general, give me all the things. Any interest to look at books on the topic that are of different cultural backgrounds if I haven't already? Yes, absolutely. I'm really interested in intersections of understandings of disability across cultures. I'm aware that my current lens is extremely Anglocentric.
Kit, I think I have a question I would like to ask about.
Of course.
Do you think this kind of science fiction and fantasy writing could allow us to see the vulnerability of non-disabled character and changing the binary between what is disabled, what is not?
I think that's part of the reason why a lot of science fiction that deals with implants or cybernetics or can make people feel really uncomfortable, because often it will tie into sort of transhumanist ideas of like, what makes a person, like, and if somebody's wearing prosthetics not simply to try and survive but for the joy of it or for self-improvement. I think that I also think that these texts will allow for just a more interesting understanding of things like how language works. There's one really wonderful fantasy novel called Tess of the Road that I look at in Crip world building, where a character has to learn another fantasy race's language, and this this fantasy language has the idea of the contradictory case. So it's a linguistic particle that you attach to a noun, and once you do that, then that noun becomes both itself and the opposite of itself simultaneously. So you're both, dog and not dog, kit, not kit. But she uses it, this character, to better conceptualize herself after a hugely traumatic experience. And so, it becomes, she is fine, not fine. She has joy, not joy. She's able to hold these two concepts in her mind. She is cured, not cured. And that, I remember just encountering it and feeling like the fantasy linguistic potential for articulating ambiguity in this way was really powerful. And that's something that required quite granular fictional world building on the part of the author there.
And a follow-up question, do you see a place for this kind of technique in academia? I mean, not only the research, because nowadays in design studies and even social sciences, people are using these techniques of writing. Do you think a place of it in our teaching, in our assessments, in information studies especially?
I would like to believe so. When I feel like we're all getting a much better understanding of positionality and learning how to talk about who we are in the context of where we are and what we're teaching. And disability studies has had an influence on that. It's not the only influence, but it's definitely one. And I think whenever you're designing an assessment, if you're trying to design an inclusive assessment, then you are in a way world building. You are the act of designing a rubric is world building, if you want to get really conceptual about it, because you are imposing your own hierarchies of what an HD looks like versus a pass. And if we are able to truly design something more inclusive, then we'd be able to subvert that a little bit. I don't think any of us have succeeded, but it's definitely something I work towards.
Interesting. Kit, there's a question in the chat box from Sindiso. He asked, when the Crip authors are writing their literature, does your analysis still stand?
I would say so. Because not all disabled writers will be writing about the lived experience of disability. And also, I think that disabled writers are often writing the most interesting stuff about disability. Andrew Joseph White, another author I talk about in the book, is both autistic and trans, and the work that he creates explicitly tries to engage with both of these elements and intermesh them in really complicated and interesting ways that tend to make some people really uncomfortable, because there is a lot of discourse on the trans scholarship side saying that transness should not be conceptualized in the same term as disability, because disability is so inherently negative. And meanwhile, we've got disability studies saying disability is not inherently negative, and we have many shared experiences. But they also then will often go full social model and not factor in any grief or angst about gender dysphoria, for example. And so, the work of authors like Andrew Joseph White sort of removes the tension by acknowledging it and saying that, we will all still respond to texts in different ways. Sorry, I'm not sure if that was entirely coherent, Cindy, but I would say that Crip analysis of Crip writing is a huge part of disability studies, and increasingly more so in literary work. There is a truly wonderful argument that close textual analysis is autistic reading. I believe that was from Remy Yogo. It's one of my favorites, and I know that the work that I'm doing on stigma in the information professions, when I'm not looking at disability in works for children, is definitely partly driven by my own experiences of stigma in the information profession and wanting to see who is out there who has experienced what I have, or who has experienced completely different, manifestations of it.
Yes, Michelle, please.
Hello. Thank you, Kit.
Hi, Michelle.
Just made me think about the work of sound studies scholar Jonathan Sturt, who writes about his own disability and a device that he built to wear, a wearable device that he built to be able to hear and vocalize himself better. So he suffered from throat cancer and so wasn't really able to speak. He sadly passed away at the beginning of last year.
I think I
anyway,
remember.
Yeah, right. So just because it made me think about that, right? It's from a sound studies perspective as well, and disability from a sound studies perspective. I think that he kind of writes about it and talks about it as a change in cultural practice rather than a medical condition. And so he was thinking through that through his sound studies writing.
Absolutely. And sound and specifically vocalization is so fraught from a disability standpoint. Talking about disability hierarchies, there is the fact that I am here talking to you about disability partly because I am able to speak in a way that is mutually intelligible. That does not discount the work, thoughts, and efforts of people who are nonverbal, but people who are nonverbal will often be less present in academic conference situations, for example.
Very interesting discussions. Oh, yes, Rachel, is your hands up?
Yeah, I actually wanted to pick up on the idea of the nonverbal and connect it back to, because you'd previously sort of commented that this idea of close reading being autistic reading as an observation someone had made. And while on one hand I can kind of see that, on the other hand, having profound experience with people who are extremely autistic and nonverbal, who have very, very profoundly different behaviors to the average person, who can't really just exist in a framework where we can say, oh yeah, that person's just a little bit different or whatever. That there are these interesting lines upon which not only can we have an easier or harder time maybe writing to certain types of ability or disability, but at the same time that certain audiences may have different experiences of that disability based on their own living, and that they may not be able to connect with other people's interpretations of that. What are your thoughts on, because that's a really complex issue, and then when it then goes through to become, scholarized and turned into a product of academic review, how do you cope with that?
So many disclaimers, all of the disclaimers. But I understand. I can't watch much cerebral palsy stand-up comedy, and we're all hilarious, but because of my own experiences of the particular medical interventions that are being made fun of, no, can't be me. And I just get a visceral response to it. And even vocal patterns that I don't have but many people do, and that is often to do with my own internalized ableist stuff around growing up in a hierarchical system. But there's also the observation from Chris Bell that disability studies is still white disability studies. Even with my own work, I worked really hard to incorporate experiences of neurodivergence and invisible disabilities and chronic pain in the second half of the book. But the first half, and the bit that I originally pitched as the PhD, was entirely physical representations of disability that I initially had read in works and then resonated with. And so, again, that's why I am interested in fantasy and science fiction, in the children's award winners, because there might be a more sort of hypothetical, like a more conceptual or metaphorical understanding of disability that could be deployed there, as opposed to just purely representational stuff. And I think the more we the more we can tolerate that, the less fraught the conversation can be. But it will always be fraught for as long as we have to compete for resources, both in the sense of disability studies is a small field, and that all of us have grown up, or anyone with any experience of disability will have grown up needing to negotiate that in their own way. I will also say that this, my question about, someone comes in and asks for a book with a primary character with a disability, what do you do, is based off my own experience of very bad reader's advisory when I was about 10. And I went in really wanting to know, what was in the library about a disabled person like me. And I was just given every copy of What Katie Did or Pollyanna under the sun. And, I remember High Toast, arguing that I really wanted something with dragons in it, if at all possible. And the librarian at the time was like, I don't think there are any disabled dragons, which was a truly inspired comment that I will take to my grave and possibly use as a book title one day.
Interesting. Yeah, it's good to have Toast as well joining us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Toothless is a disabled dragon, and I love him. How to Tame Your Dragon was a true moment of euphoria in the cinema. What do you mean? It's a metaphor, and the leg, and the wing, and they're doing it, and it's real. And I cried. It was the exact opposite experience of watching Avatar, the James Cameron Avatar in the cinema, where somebody is so horrified at the idea of remaining paraplegic that he uploads himself into a blue alien to colonize a planet. Again, this is why representation, but perhaps especially also metaphorical representation, is important in a wide range of types of texts. And yes, better to be Indigenous than a disabled white man. It was that film is a mess.
You could write a whole book just on hating Avatar.
There's 5 of them now.
So there was very interesting discussion. We can leave it here, but unless anyone has any burning questions, please go for it now.
Or reclaim your lunch.
So please join me thanking Dr. Kit for such a thought-provoking and important topic. Thank you so much, Kit.
Thank you
there
so
is
much.
A question. No, I saw a hand up. Thank you, Kit. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So thank you, and I wish that you enjoy your lunch, and we will have our next SICS seminar for the next month. You will receive the announcement. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Kit.
Thank you.